If you want to follow along, I recommend this dbfiddle website. It's a free website and you don't even need to create an account. When you open the website, just click on SQL Server, that's the flavor of SQL that we're using for these videos, and make sure you choose AdventureWorks as the database. That will give you access to all of the same sample data that I'm using in these videos. In this video, we're going to be talking about subqueries in SQL. Now, this is a concept in SQL that really doesn't have an Excel equivalent, so we can't really piggyback off of any Excel knowledge that we already have for subqueries. So for this one, we're not even going to think about Excel whatsoever. That means that the concepts in this one might be a little harder to grasp than any of the previous videos, but subqueries are really important. They're a really important part of the SQL language. So if you're not comfortable with subqueries by the end of this, that's absolutely fine. That's absolutely okay. But they are quite a crucial part of working with SQL. So maybe leave this video to the very last, get up to speed with SQL first, be happy with everything else that feels more like Excel, and then come back to this when you're ready to improve your SQL skills a little bit more. But what is a subquery? It's just a smaller query, or a query inside another query. And this is one of the most powerful things about SQL. We saw with union that we can have two separate queries being glued together with the union special word. But subqueries are having some SQL code inside another SQL code, another piece of SQL code. This is probably sounding quite mysterious, probably sounded a bit weird. And why would we even want this anyway? We haven't needed it so far. So today we're going to jump into why you would want these and good ways to structure them and to keep them readable. As always, let's use our favorite department table. We've seen that we can do a few things with the department table. For example, we can keep certain columns. Let's keep the department ID, the name, and the group name. Let's forget about modified date for the time being. We've also seen that we can filter it with the where clause. So we can write something like where the department ID is less than 5. Let's run this to see what we get. Here we go. We get 4 rows on the output. One of the cool things about subqueries is they allow us to reuse output and pretend it's a table. What does that mean? Well, I'm going to write something a bit quirky. What I'm going to do is I'm going to write another select. For now, I'll just do select star from. And I'm going to wrap all of this in brackets. And let's give it a name. For now, let's just call it subquery. So what have I done here? This looks a bit weird. I've said select everything from, and then I've written another subquery. I've written another query, some more SQL code inside these brackets. When SQL code like this is inside brackets, you've got a select statement inside some brackets. That's when it becomes a subquery. So this is a subquery. We've seen that the output of this are these 4 rows. It's 3 columns, 4 rows. So what we can do is we can push that result, that output, into a new query. We can almost pretend that this output is a table. So if I run this again, this shouldn't change anything. Absolutely. But what can we do with this now? Well, if I was to try and do department ID, name, group name, modified date, well, I can't grab modified date because it's not in this output. What could we do? We could use another where condition. We could add another where clause. Let's add a where clause on the outside, filtering for group name. Let's keep group name as research and development. How many rows are we going to get back? Well, we only get 2 rows. Why are we not getting 3 rows? Because we filter the department ID is less than 5 first in this subquery. So we only end up with these 4 rows. And on these 4 rows, we're then applying this filter as well, research and development, which is why we only end up with the 2 rows. Similarly, let's do some renaming. Let's say this is just ID. Let's call it dep ID. Let's call this dep name. And let's call this group. See my, well, we'll keep that as group name. We can see that my SQL application is already complaining. It's complaining because it doesn't know what these columns are now. We've renamed them to dep ID and dep name. So we need to use them as dep ID and dep name up here. Oh, dep name. Let's rerun this. Now it works. So these subqueries, the way of using subqueries like this, it's just one query produces an output. We then push that into another subquery pretending that it's a table. That's really all it is when we use subqueries like this. Now, this is a silly example. We've seen lots of silly examples. So let's take a look at a more genuine example. Where's an actual case where we would want to use subqueries? Let's go back to the sales table that we used in the aggregates video. Remember, we had a table that had a row for every sale. It had various dates corresponding to that sale, various account and customer numbers, various sales metrics to do with the corresponding cost of that sale, the value of that sale. Let's try and do something with this. So remember, we used the order date, we used the online order flag, and we used the total due. I'll run this just to make sure that we can see it. Cool. Now, one of the things that we did with the order date was that we applied a format to it. We did format, and we applied this format. We applied the year, month format. So we'll call this order, year, month. I'll rerun this just to remind us what the output of this looks like. Here we go. It's just the year and the month. And we did this because then we whacked it into the group by statement. But remember, we had to repeat this in the group by statement. So just for good measure, we did also add in the year filter. So let's do the year filter as well. It was years 2013. And then we added in the group by. But we had to group by the same calculation. We also grouped by the online order flag. And we did the sum of total due. And we call that sum total due. So let's give this a run just to make sure it works. Of course, here we go. Now, if this was a more complicated formula, then having to write it in two places or more than two places even could be a little inconvenient. If we needed to make any tweaks to that, we need to make sure that we tweak it in every single place that we've written it. So using a subquery would allow us to define it once and then reuse it multiple times. Let's see this in action. So what am I going to do? I'm going to ignore the aggregation for the moment. I'm going to wrap all of this in a subquery. And we need to put the subquery into a from. So for now, I'm just going to do select star from. In SQL Server, we always need to give our subqueries names. This is the table aliases that we've seen before. So we'll call this, it doesn't matter, we'll just call it formatted sales for the moment. Now you see we don't have order date anymore. Order date's not a column on this subquery. Instead, we can go ahead and use order year month straight away. So let's update our columns. What columns do we have available? Well, the only columns that we have available are order year month, online order flag, and total due. They're the only columns that are being spat out by the subquery, which we've called formatted sales. So now we can whack in the sum again, call this sum total due, and now let's run this to see what we get. We get the same thing, but the convenience of the subquery means that we don't have to rewrite the calculation for order year month. And in fact, if we had done some filtering on the outside, let's say we wanted the order year month is 2013 January, February, and March, we can filter directly on this calculated column. Remember, we use the in condition if we want to filter on multiple values. We want them all to be 2013, and we want the first one to be 01, the second one to be 02, the third one to be 03. So we're filtering on that calculated column. So let's rerun this. Here we go. This is the output that we get. So we can define a column once and reuse it in loads of different places, which is really, really convenient. This is one of my favorite ways to use subqueries. I'll format, or I'll adjust my underlying data. I'll do some calculations. I'll do everything up front so that downstream of that subquery, or outside of that subquery, I can just go and use the calculated columns that I've already set up inside the subquery. I don't need to repeat those calculations multiple times. Keeps the code very clean because we only need to define things once and then we can reuse them. We've seen that we can put subqueries after the from to reuse the result of a subquery. I'll mention now, we're not going to see an example of it, but since we can put it after from, that means that we can also put it after join, if we were doing a join in our SQL code. We're not going to see that now. Instead, we're going to see some other places that we can put subqueries. So a typical interview question, we don't actually do this quite so much in practice, but it's a good one for illustrating how we can use subqueries. A typical interview question could be something like, if this is the sales information, keep the sales whose sale value, whose total due value, is greater than the average total due value. We can actually do this in Excel. Excel has an option for this. So if we go over to the total due value and we go into the number filters, we'll see that it does have an option for above average. So let's hit that one. There we go. Let's see if we can do the same thing with SQL. Well, since we're filtering rows, we're going to start with a where. And we know we want to filter something about the total due. We want it to be greater than, however, we're going to compute the average. So how can we compute the average? We use a subquery. The subquery that I'm going to write, I'm just going to select the average. Remember, average is AVG in SQL, which is slightly different to Excel. In Excel, it's the full word average. In SQL, it's just AVG. I want the average total due value from this table. So rather than returning a whole table, this is just going to return, or produce, rather than producing a whole table, this is just going to produce a single value. Let's run this bit by itself first, just to prove it. So I'm just going to run this. We just get a single value. That means that when we use it in the where condition, we can compare the existing total due values to the output of this subquery because it's a single value. So let's run this to see what we get. Seems to have worked. And it seems to have already been sorted in sales order ID order, but let's just do that explicitly so that we can make sure that we're doing a fair comparison to the Excel version on the left. Sales order ID. So I'm going to rerun this. Here we go. So it's 43659, 661, 662, 664, 665, etc. So we have indeed done the same as what we've done on the left in Excel. We have indeed filtered for the sales whose total due value is larger than the average total due value for that table. The important difference between this subquery and the one that we saw before, this is a single value, so we can use it for comparison. Whereas the previous one spat out an entire table, so we could use it in a from or a join. We could also use this output in the select. So let's just keep a few columns that we care about first, and then we'll see how we would do that. So let's keep sales order ID, and I think just the total due. I think that's the only information that we care about right now. We know that these are all the ones that are larger than the average, but we can't actually see what the average is on the output. So what we can do, we can also include this in here, in the select statement. Since this is going to produce a value, we can use this as a column in our output. So let's call this average total due. Let me rerun this. So now we see that that average value that we're comparing against, we can actually also see in the select output as well. So we know that all of these are greater than the average and that the average is this value. So these are two ways that we can use subqueries in a different way to the way that we use them by putting them into the from statement or the join statement. Let's go back to the example from earlier. This is where we use the subquery inside the from. Just run this again just to prove that it works. Although we can use the subqueries directly inside the from, there's an alternative way that we can define our subqueries. And the queries that are defined in this way are going to be called common table expressions, or CTEs for short. The way that we define CTEs is by writing with at the very, very, very top. Then we specify the name that we want to use. I've used the name formatted sales down here. So let's reuse it up the top here. We're just going to be moving this subquery up here. Let's move this bit up here. What this will do is it's kind of like defining a variable, if that means anything to you. We're saving the result of this subquery to this name. And then we can reference that name pretending it's a table. So let me run this just to prove that it works. It sure does. So this is awesome. This means that we can break up what was previously quite a busy bit of SQL code into effectively two smaller bits of SQL code. It's easy to understand that this formatted sales is just whatever this is, whatever this subquery does. And then we can see that the aggregation is just on formatted sales, doing all of this business. So whenever you're writing subqueries that you want to use in from or in join, I'd strongly recommend using the with statement, defining them as common table expressions instead of using subqueries directly inside your query. This only applies to subqueries that you want to use after from or after join. The ones that we saw earlier where we're using them in the where or we were using them directly in a column, keep those as subqueries like normal. But if you're going to be using something in a from, you're going to be using a subquery in a from or in a join, I strongly recommend to move it out into this with statement. And we can have multiple CTEs in here if we want. We just need to make sure that we separate them with commas. So let's do another one. So I could call this aggregated sales. Just for now, let's whack all of this in to here, to the aggregated sales. So you see we define this subquery as formatted sales. We'll then use that query to define aggregated sales, and then we can use aggregated sales on the outside as well. So we can do, let's just select everything from aggregated sales. Bit of a silly example, but just to prove that we can do it. And I'll run this, we get our output still. So this is a really nice way to break up subqueries. Define them as common table expressions to keep each one small and easy to understand. Just makes the SQL query a lot easier to read and understand. So let's wrap up. We've seen that subqueries are a way to nest queries inside other queries. This can be convenient for reusing calculations multiple times. We could wrap this query into another subquery, or into another query. And remember, in SQL Server, we always need to give the subqueries names. So this would just give us quick access to the columns that we calculated inside the subquery. We've also seen that when we use subqueries in this way, we can define them as common table expressions with the with special word. This allows us to define our subqueries at the top of our query and then reference them downstream. We've also seen that we can put subqueries in other places. For example, we could use subqueries in a where condition. Using subqueries, it's one of the most powerful parts about SQL, but it is one of the parts that diverges the most from Excel. So it does take some time wrapping your head around using subqueries in SQL. So if you're not comfortable with subqueries yet, that's absolutely fine. Practice the other bits that we've gone through so far. Get familiar with SQL, get confident writing the SQL elements that are similar to Excel, and then come back to this one later when you're ready to extend your SQL skills. But that wraps up everything for today. I hope you found this useful, and we'll catch you in the next one.